Joining us today. Delighted to have a group of our close friends joining us for this director's briefing, but just to warn those of you who've come and joined us today that we're also broadcasting this series live today through our live stream capacity online, because we thought it'd be a great opportunity for a broader audience to be able to join us for this next in our series of centenary conversations that we're having to mark this special week for Chatham House. 100 years ago, last weekend, 5th of July, that the Institute held its first meeting, and we just thought we would, as those of you who've joined us now on Monday, Tuesday, and earlier today, we're concentrating a series of conversations to pick up some of the main themes of Chatham House's second century, the century we're looking ahead to, which obviously would include right front and center how one is able to drive sustainable, equitable growth around the world, economic growth in particular. And this is a challenge that I think is going to be made all the more difficult, obviously in the near term, by the COVID-19 crisis and its very diverse as well as tragic impacts around the world. And one that would have been difficult under any circumstances, given the growing geopolitical competition that is undermining some of the big institutions that govern global economic responses and multilateral cooperation to big challenges. So this is a perfect time to have this conversation looking at the future of the global economy and Britain's place within it. And I'm delighted to welcome Lord Alistair Darling of Rulanish. Alistair Darling, known to all of you, I am sure, not least as his time as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2007 to 2010. He was also in a number of other cabinet positions, Secretary of Transport, Secretary for Trade and Industry, Work and Pensions, Chief Secretary of the Treasury earlier. Alistair Darling has had a very distinguished career as a parliamentarian, and we're very thrilled that he is one of our three co-presidents. So another reason why I'm thrilled Alistair is able to join us today, because he joins us not just as somebody bringing all of this experience, but somebody connected to the Institute at the most senior level as well. Alistair, welcome today. What I'm going to do, just so you all know, I said this is on the record, engage in a bit in a conversation with Alistair Darling to start with, and then bring you, the members of our directors briefing group, in to ask questions. You have two options. You can go down to your participants tab and click on the raise hand option. And I will spot that and call you in, and my colleagues will make sure that you're unmuted so you can ask the question yourself, or you can go to the Q&A function in the middle and type in your question, and I will ask that question directly to Alistair Darling and bring him in that way. So we have two different options to be able to follow here to engage those who've joined us for this call. But Alistair Darling, thank you very much for taking the time. I'm sure like all of us, you're zoomed up now after the last 2 to 3 months, but maybe you could just start off by sharing some thoughts on this interesting double question that I think you're perfectly positioned to answer. With this COVID crisis, unprecedented, people are saying since the 1920s and 30s, we've not had something as immediately devastating as this crisis. What does it mean for the UK? And as we think about the UK and it's sitting as a key player, sixth largest economy in the world, member of the G20, how do you read its position and the broader global economic response that's been taken to this crisis? But Alistair, over to you. Look forward to your thoughts and to engaging in conversation.
Thank you very much, Robin, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be at a virtual meeting in Chatham House. And also, the first time I've spoken in Chatham House, not obeying Chatham House rules, and neither are you. We decided to make this open. Firstly, let me say I'm acutely conscious that there is another attraction in town at the moment, and that just as I'm speaking, one of my successors as Chancellor of the Exchequer is also addressing the House of Commons at the same time. So I hope that what I say is still as in date now as it may be in 20 minutes' time. What I want to do is to look at the economic and the political consequences of the fallout of this virus. I'm going to concentrate quite deliberately on the short and medium term, because quite frankly, nobody knows what the long term is going to look like. Robin, you said this is possibly one of the worst things we've seen for 100 years, with the exception of clearly the two world wars, which were very different, but had a profound economic impact. Then I think this is certainly up there, unfortunately, with one of the worst things that's happened to the world, not least because nobody's yet clear how we're going to control it and contain it. Now, the other thing that I would emphasize is that this is still developing. I don't think we're halfway through this yet, even though we may be getting the rate of mortality is falling. It's quite obvious there's going to be a long tail here, and there's always the risk of the second wave. And then of course the economic consequences are going to be with us very soon. This autumn, you could be faced with unemployment, the like of which we've not seen in the UK since the 1980s. And at all costs, in my view, we've got to avoid that. And the fallout, the scarring, the despair, the sense of loss that people had at that time, we just can't afford to do that again. Now, immediately, what the government needs to concentrate on is first and foremost the health aspects of this. It has taken far, far longer than anyone anticipated to get an effective testing and tracing scheme in place. And I say that not just for the health reasons, but it's also important if we're going to get people's confidence to go back and go to the shops, go to restaurants, go about their day-to-day business that they used to do. Because unless we can assure them that we know where the disease is and we can contain it, then people will be hesitant, and that will have an economic and as well as a social knock-on effect. And I think the government needs to do everything it possibly can here. It's the #1 priority for me. We were going to have a world beating up a few months ago. Well, we don't seem to have got one yet. We haven't a moment to lose here. It really is important if we're going to maintain that confidence. The second thing, of course, the government's got to do is to make sure that the economy doesn't collapse. Now, let me say right at the start, I think that the Chancellor did exactly the right thing with the furlough scheme, the support for the self-employed and so on. But remember this, that when these schemes come to an end, typically somebody coming off one of the job support schemes and going on to universal credit, which is now the UK's principal support mechanism, they'll see their incomes drop by just under 50%. That is a huge drop. And that's why I hope that the Chancellor will take steps to be flexible about the furlough scheme and other schemes as well as introducing some of the schemes that we've seen trailed already. As I say, we simply cannot afford to let our economy collapse because it will take a long, long time to recover if that happens. People ask me, do I think it's going to be a V-shaped recession, or is it going to be W or whatever? I'm quite sure that we can all agree that the downward slope of the V is happening now and will continue to happen. I think there will be a bounce back, but I think the recovery is going to be a lot longer than people expect. And I got into terrible trouble 10 years ago when I said that the crisis then was going to be more profound and long-lasting than people thought, and everybody said what a gloom monger I was and so on. Well, unfortunately, that proved to be the case. If it doesn't happen, I'll be very happy, but we've got to prepare and assume that that is precisely what is going to happen. So what the government is looking for, and what the public want to see from that government, is that we contain the health epidemic, and at the same time that we take action to preserve the economy. They're looking for a degree of competence, not just here, but across the world. And the progress we make both on health and economy will very much shape the economy and politics of the next decade and beyond that. Now, looking ahead, and just bear in mind that we in particular, but no country particularly, entered this in a particularly great shape. Austerity in one form or other has been practiced right across the globe. You've seen people whose living standards have fallen, their incomes have been squeezed, their expectations have been diminished, and frankly, they're angry about it. And you've got this COVID virus on top of all that, which is bound to make a difficult problem worse, even with all the best will in the world. And one of the things that I think that we are going to have to look at, not just here but elsewhere, and that is the role of the state. It's only 40 odd years ago that people used to go on about big government, and governments were just getting in the way, and we didn't want them and all that. Well, I found out 10 years ago. I remember speaking to the people running Britain's banks who used to have hardly a good word to say about the government. But it was a different tune in October 2008 when they said, "What can you do to help us?" Government is at the end of the day is not just the lender of last resort, it's the insurer of last resort, and it may be for a while the provider of last resort in more areas than it's been for a long, long time. And I think we have to recognize that governments can do things that we as individuals can't do. I'm not one that would argue the government ought to be doing everything and providing everything and lots of nationalisation and things like that. But the government is there for a purpose, and it's time that we recognise that. We saw that 10 years ago when I was Chancellor. At the end of the day, the only thing that was big enough to stop a total collapse was the government itself. So what's to be done? Firstly, I think the government, looking at as we start to recover, we've got to make sure we've got resilience in our institutions. The NHS here, there's an example there. It hardly needs stating, but memories can be short. We've got to make sure that if this happens again, something will come along at some stage that we are prepared for it, because we were woefully unprepared. The just-in-time approach to funding the NHS doesn't work. When frankly you've got a crisis. Now, I mentioned government has a role, and I think looking forward it does have a role to provide a framework against which the private sector, private firms can plan, and we as individuals can plan, but they also can lay foundations that frankly is very difficult to do as individuals. There's been a lot of talk about the need to prepare for a carbon-free economy. Well, the government has not yet provided a plan of things that we would need to do if we're going to get there. Now's the opportunity to do that and to help investment achieve that. In energy, for example, we could start in also reforming our energy market in the UK, which is not terribly effective. Equally, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, transport, and so on. What I'd say to the government is you get more bang for your bucks here, the smaller and more manageable these projects are. HS2, which I'll put my cards on the table, I'm not a supporter of, you won't see the benefits of that for maybe 30 years with the best will in the world. We need more to see benefits before that. Equally, if we're going to have a knowledge-based economy, our broadband needs improved. It's not as good as it should be for an advanced economy like ours. And there's things like housing. In the 1950s, it was a badge of honor for ministers, conservative ministers in those days, to every year to stand up and say, look how many public sector houses I've built. That went rather out of fashion in the Thatcher years, and we need to rediscover that. There's also a couple of structural issues I've mentioned, and there's more than a couple to be dealt with, but just two I would mention. One is we do need to look at our supply chains. It's all very well to say we can source stuff from all over the world, and that's just as fine as you can get it. If you can't get it, you can see the obvious problems. I'm not a protectionist, but I think we do need to look at our resilience as far as that's concerned. But there is a big issue that I think the government will overlook at its peril, and this applies just about in every country in the world, and that is this virus has exposed the lack of financial resilience too many people in this country have. They don't have savings to fall back on. They're earning money that just about gets them by, but if something happens, it gets cut. They don't have anything to tide them over. And this has been going on for the last 20 odd years, the gig economy. People who've got short-term contracts, people who are classified as self-employed, but objectively they are employed. We have got to stop this, because when it comes, it's not just in a crisis like this, but when people employed like this come to retire, they won't have the contributions. They won't have anything to look after them in their old age. And that means at the end of the day, frankly, you've got to pay people properly. And the government, only the government can put in place a framework to make sure that happens. So I've been talking now about what I think the UK ought to be doing, both immediately and in the medium term, and frankly, that could apply for just about any country in the world. But I want to just say a word about the international scene. 10 years ago, when we were faced with a recession becoming a depression right across the world, we had in the G20 group of nations, countries from just about every political hue you can imagine. We had communist China, we had Republican-led United States, and we all sat around the table in Washington and then in London in 2009, and we agreed to do exactly the same thing. And actually doing the same thing together does inspire confidence. That was a huge boost to get the economies growing again 10 years ago. Frankly, I doubt if we could do that today. But I'll just make the point, you need to learn from experience. In 1945, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the UN was set up, the IMF was set up. These are examples of where the world realized there are some things actually we can do better together than that rather individually. Trade is an example of where, especially for us post-Brexit, we're going to have to strike new trade agreements. That means international cooperation. Trade means give and take. And that's why cooperation is so important. And incidentally, so too is the need to tackle the growing and dire situation that many poorer countries will face as a result of this pandemic, where frankly their health services are in some cases elementary. They don't have the social security systems that developed economies have got. And the IMF ought to be able to do more than it is at the moment by extending special drawing rights to these countries as well. And my final point is in relation to the politics of all this. The populist nationalism, you might call it that way, has been in the ascendancy now for about 10 years. And I think just now provides, it's one of these turning points. There's two ways you can go down. You can try and draw up the bridges. You can try and practice isolationism, go it alone and so on. I don't think that'll work. The case needs to be made for the fact that the best way of helping ourselves is sometimes to help others along the way. And that needs leadership. If you look at, I'll just pick three examples, two of which have been prayed and aid quite a lot in the last few weeks. Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt and Churchill were big men with big ideas. And the key thing is, if you look at the Roosevelt and his New Deal, all over America, you can see things he did then that are still serving the American people today. Churchill, self-evidently, in 1940. I'd add another one as far as Britain is concerned, and that's Attlee. Attlee, who headed the Labour government immediately after the Second World War, put in place a welfare state, a large amount of which is still in place today, most of all the NHS. 80 years later, what he did is still there. And incidentally, his socialism was built through practical experience in 1930s East London, when he saw the problems, he saw the poverty, and he knew what to be done. So I hope that perhaps some good will come out of this, and it might be a turning point. However, just at the moment, I think the jury is very much out on that one. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions or to respond to comments that you or anyone else wants to make.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair, for laying out these two sides of the coin, the UK's particular challenges, and then some of your thoughts about how we try to keep an open system. So as you said, we have a cooperative set of solutions going forward. I've got a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A line. So let me encourage others who want to bring questions in to please add them there. And again, I'll look out in case anyone wants to put their hands up by going to the participants list and then clicking raise hands at the bottom, and then we can call on you and you can ask your question live if you wish to. Otherwise, if I get questions in the Q&A line, I will just take them straight out of there and read them out to Alistair. But before I go to those, Alistair, I wanted to bring one particular issue to bear that didn't come up in your opening remarks about the UK. You noted at the beginning, this is certainly one of the worst economic moments for the United Kingdom. And you're right, I shouldn't have just mentioned the Great Depression. There were 2 world wars in there as well, which also had pretty cataclysmic effects on Britain's economic position. One issue, though, that has been different in the past and that feels very different today is the pound. The role of the pound. I mean, some of the big crisis moments the UK has had in recent decades have been where people have maybe lost confidence in the currency in some shape or form. At the moment, we seem to be able to borrow money at incredibly low interest rates, long dated, and yet we're heading into levels of debt. We're going to have a deficit this year of 15–16% of GDP, way above what happened in the austerity years that well, not the austerity years, the immediate response period that you had to bring in straight after the global financial crisis. As we look at this from the outside, are you worried at all that this government could find itself constrained in 1 or 2 years' time, depending on how the recovery goes, by any risks on the value of the pound? And could you just, for all of us, help us think through, if you were Chancellor and sitting there, would that be anywhere on your list of worries? Or is that something that right now, even with Brexit, obviously we weren't in the Euro, but we at least kind of existed within a larger market. Britain is a little more alone than it was in 2008-9. Where would this fit on your list of worries? Not at all, somewhere in the middle? Where would you put it?
Well, when you're the Chancellor, you worry about everything. Though historically chancellors, well, certainly in modern times, haven't talked about the pound that much, because usually if you say anything, it causes no end of problems. But I remember when I was growing up in my teenage years, of course, in the 1960s, people talked about the pound and the balance of payments. Remember them? We used to talk about that all the time. But I think you always have to be careful, and you can't assume that if you've got benign conditions just now that they'll continue indefinitely, because things can change, and they can change for rational reasons or totally irrational reasons. I used to describe it from time to time, when you look at all these risks, and certainly if you look at the borrowing level, it's like walking over a frozen pond. It's perfectly all right until you go under, but you don't know when you're going under, and once you've gone under, it's too late to worry about it. So you've got to be mindful of that. But on the more positive side, yes, our borrowing is probably as high as it's been for it's going to be as high as it's been for nearly 300 years. The last time it was anything like this level was at the end of the Second World War. But my view of that is that if you didn't spend the money we're spending today, it would actually cost you a lot more. It may seem counterintuitive, but by spending money to stop the economy collapsing, you are saving yourself in other costs that you would hit in the years to come. And equally, I've always been a Keynesian. I practiced that 10 years ago when I was Chancellor. Now Keynes is back in town now, and indeed being supported by many of the people who were against his teachings, all these years ago. So I think the government is doing entirely the right thing. And we just have to face up to the fact that, rather like post-Second World War, it will take decades to get that debt level down again. Again, I mentioned earlier the fact that every other country is doing it. I think people accept that that's necessary. The other thing is, as far as the UK is concerned, is our borrowing, the term on our bonds is a lot longer than most other countries. Typically, the UK issued bonds are for over 14 years, whereas in the rest in the European Union they're more like 5 to 7 years. So we don't have to turn over the borrowing so often as other countries do. But people will look and see what we're up to. Brexit and post-Brexit, people are going to say, well, what are your trading deals? You said it's, don't worry, you're going to get them all in place, but where are they? And the answer is, just at the moment, we're still waiting. And equally, people judge you on whether you're a competent government or not. And competence is hard to win and very easy to lose. So I think provided the government plays its cards right and provided it does sensible things, then we can do that. The key thing, though, as I said right at the start, is that the best defense against all this is to get our economy going again. And I won't repeat what I said earlier, but what I've said about the conditions to get that to happen.
And just following up on that particular point, I've got some nice questions coming up, which I'll turn to in a second. You talked about the importance of investment, and as long as you're spending money and it's for the right reason, this is a very good time to do so. Markets are favorable, interest rates are certainly favorable in that sense. How do you prioritize? I think you made a quick comment about HS2 there and so on, but this government has talked very much about shovel-ready projects. How much of this is short-term? Where, if you were Chancellor, would you be putting that real emphasis in terms of long-term investments to deliver long-term returns? The kind of returns that obviously the markets will be looking at to know that if you're making that investment, you're getting the return. I thought I heard you being a little skeptical about maybe some of the big infrastructure projects such as rail and so on. Could you just unpack that a little bit for us and how you would prioritize the list?
Don't get me wrong, I'm very much in favour of investing in railways. I was the Secretary for Transport for 4 years, and I'm glad to say that we were able to put the funding of the railways on a proper footing for the first time in decades, actually, which is why just before this crisis, the railways were carrying more passengers than any time since they were nationalised in 1945-46. What I do know, again, from my transport experience especially, is the easiest thing in the world is to make an announcement. The most difficult thing in the world is to actually get it delivered. Last autumn, the UK government announced a road scheme that basically goes past Stonehenge in southern England. I distinctly remember announcing it 15 years ago, and it's not built. And I see they've just found something else there that will stop it being built as well, some other ancient relic. my point is, in transport, you can sometimes get an awful lot more gain for smaller, more manageable schemes that are near shovel ready. You can get them done. I mentioned housing. The big hold-up on housing, of course, is getting planning permission. But once you've got the planning permission, houses are relatively easy, and they employ lots of people to build them. So really, what I would be looking for as in the government is quite specifically, what could we get going, very quickly in the next 12 months? The thing about something like HS2, and let's leave its merits or demerits aside for a moment, is that you're starting from scratch here, and on any view, it's not going to be completed for another 20, 30 years. By which time there'll be several crises between now and then. I'm not against big infrastructure, but I think immediately what the government needs to look at these things, and things like broadband. Broadband doesn't involve digging up large chunks of the country to put it in. I think those are areas where I would encourage the government to get going, because frankly, the thing that the Chancellor announced this morning about the apprenticeships, so that the jobs guarantee for young people, very, very good. The key thing is, can you deliver it actually by October? That's not far, and certainly not far in terms of government plans. And don't blame the civil servants if it doesn't happen. Government ministers, they think up policy, they announce policy, they're responsible for the delivery of it as well.
You mentioned earlier, Alistair, that the low interest rate is a very positive dynamic for the moment, if you see what I'm saying, because it means the government can borrow and can invest in the kind of things you were talking about, and they're planning at very good interest rates. But you also made the incredibly important point that we've discovered through this crisis how vulnerable such a large proportion of our population is, living sort of paycheck to paycheck in many cases, and very low paycheck to paycheck with very small savings. And you mentioned about the risks to retirement. Doesn't this country, and many in the West, face a much more structural problem, that at this very low interest rate world, it doesn't matter, even if you're being paid a little bit more per hour, people will not have the savings for their retirement. This is a huge train wreck waiting for whoever's in government in 10, 15 years' time. What on earth could we be doing about making sure that people really do have savings they can turn to in a meaningful way, as opposed to just having another 30, 40 pounds a week they can spend on surviving?
Well, you make a very good point. And of course, low interest rates, there are two competing and conflicting pressures here. One is the one you quite rightly said, that if you're saving money, low interest rates are a very bad thing, and for pensions as well. For people borrowing money to spend, to invest, it's a good thing. I think it's fair to say that 10 years ago, when, for example, we introduced quantitative easing, we saw it as something that would last maybe 1 or 2 years. We didn't expect it to become a way of life. Whereas QE in its various forms is being practiced across the world, and far from being, phased out, it's being stepped up. And you're even talking about negative interest rates. Quite how that works with someone who's got a little bit of money in the bank, I don't know. I think the low interest rate environment is going to be with us for some considerable time, which will affect, people's long-term savings, their pensions, and so on. I think there's another thing which I would add in, which is also a worry, is in most countries, pensions are pay-as-you-go. It's not like when you're saving your money, it was in a bank or something, and it's been accruing interest and so on. And we are in a situation now where the millennial generation, who don't have so many savings, they don't have houses, the job situation is much more precarious, and they are being hit disproportionately by this virus. They are paying through their taxes for the pensions of the baby boom generation, who do have assets, do have houses, where a lot of them were benefiting from very good pensions and schemes and so on. So I mentioned the structural problems in relation to the rising generation, but there is an overall structural problem, but it probably affects every developed country at the moment, because they're broadly in the same position. But I don't see interest rates going up anytime soon.
So we're going to face that dilemma. I should have noted that was actually a question which I'd been thinking about, and forgot to note that Hugh Jenkins asked that question about the impact on pensions with zero interest rates. I remember I was involved in a study at CSIS a long time ago, talking about Europeans pay-as-you-go vulnerability, precisely what you mentioned. I remember David Willits at that time coming over to Washington saying, don't worry, the UK is in a much better position. We don't have pay-as-you-go. We've got everyone investing and looking after their own pension pots. but it sounds to me as if having your own pension pot is also a vulnerability if your ability to invest it for a decent return, is not on the horizon. So, in any case, it sounds to me that needs to be added to the list of risks. Let me just go slightly more into the international space, because I've got a couple of questions here, and I might come back to the UK again in a minute. A couple of more international questions. Anne Cormack, who's actually a member of our council, and David Manning, a member of our panel senior advisors, both asked a question on either side of the same ledger, which is, how likely do you think it is that we could have a different type of new Bretton Woods emerge over the next few years? David Manning wonders if there's a change of administration, could you get back to the kind of G20 cooperation that we saw in 2008, or are we going to have to look for some type of different model for the future? And Anne was specifically asking about, could you have a new Bretton Woods? Was at a global level, and what's the likelihood of success in the current political environment? What's your reading of this? Because if that's not an option, well, there's a bunch of questions that flow on from that. So what do you think, given your experience?
Well, to be realistic, if you're going to have a global settlement, then you need the United States and China to play and to be active in it, because they are by far the biggest economies. And just at the moment, there's a bit of a standoff between those two countries, and I think we're all aware of all the difficulties. Now, you could say, well, why can't the rest of the G20, for example, or other countries, do things themselves? I think there's 2 points I'd make there. One is it's very difficult to get a global settlement where two countries, the United States has led, frankly, a lot of thinking in the world for a lot of the last century, right up to this. I think the other thing is that, the dominant political mood at the moment, and, in other countries too, is more isolationist. We've just left the European Union, which was one of the biggest blocs in the world. And so, frankly, unless there's a change in political view, and away from where we've been for the last, I say, 10 years or so, then it's going to be very, very difficult. And the problem with that is that the losers on all these things tend to be not just poorer countries, but people on low incomes. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. But, at the end of the day, it comes down to, leadership and an acceptance that sometimes, no matter how, there's no country in this world that is truly independent that can't survive with, to some degree, having relations with other countries. And we just have to recognize, surely this virus has demonstrated, if nothing else had done, is that the virus didn't recognize any political boundaries as it went around the world. All the more reason for us to act together, whether it's on health or the economy. So I'm afraid I can't give an answer to either of these questions, but it's very clear to me you must get the big countries in the same room if it's going to work.
Talking about getting the big countries in the room, a question that inevitably comes up at this time. Gay Huey Evans, also a member of our panel senior advisors, asked the question about, where do you stand, or what position should, I won't paraphrase that, she asked very specifically, what position should the UK take vis-a-vis China? Obviously, you'll give your opinion on this, but we have the specifics of Hong Kong, and our response in terms of visas and immigration, and was that the right call to make, in your opinion, to step forward and make that kind of offer? And more broadly, you mentioned the need for rapid broadband. There was one way of getting rapid, at least high-speed broadband, which was to somehow find a way to continue working with Huawei, which looks like is going to be stymied, has been stymied by the changes in the US administration policy towards the kind of technology Huawei can now access. But where does Alistair Darling sit on the China question? Obviously, you have the benefit of not having to sit around the cabinet table and maybe answer it to the Daily Mail or the Guardian. But where would you be advising this kind of a government, or even the Labour opposition right now, to be positioned on China?
Well, look, it follows from everything I've said this afternoon, that I'm an internationalist. We live in one world. And frankly, we're going to have to engage, if you take China's point with Hong Kong or Huawei or whatever, you've got to engage with them, because sooner or later that's what happens. If you look at conflicts, at whatever level, the way they get resolved is that sooner or later both sides realize it's actually in their interest to resolve it. Clearly, I don't have access to the intelligence as far as security is concerned, and Huawei is concerned. So I don't know, and that is clearly defending our interests and our security is important. And on Hong Kong, there's an example of clearly we have an obligation there because we were part of the deal that was signed 30 years ago. But frankly, to be realistic, it needs more than just us involved in this. Because the best way in which you can police these things is if, as much as possible, you get other countries in the world acting together. There used to be something called the United Nations that used to do these things, but the problem we have got is the institutions that were set up to deal with problems like this, 80 years ago now, have been trashed quite deliberately by people all over the world. I think we will pay a heavy price for that, and it will just take a long time to get through it.
Just to dig into this a little bit more, and then I'm going to turn to Creon Butler, who's the program director of our global economy team. And Creon, as I think you're here, at least a Chatham House person will have to share their voice live. So we'll turn to Creon in a minute and let him unmute. But just to stick to this broader question on China and so on, would you advocate that this is a different world? In other words, you may have heard this phrase right now, like-minded countries, that it's a time for like-minded countries to group together, almost to kind of step back to step forward, that this idea of maybe we don't need a G7, we need a D10. Make sure they're all democracies, make sure that they are big enough that they can have clout as a group, be inclusive, but recognize that China is just not on the same track as other countries are, maybe Russia and some others don't want to be either. And that depending on where the United States comes up in the next few months and into the future, we need to go back to something like the GATT. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was just a small group of countries originally, all willing to observe certain rules and then invited others to join. In your experience, could we afford to take a step backwards to go forwards? If we almost hit the limit of what's possible at this big multilateral global level, and as you said, it's a kind of, no one seems to be able to agree on anything right now. Would you be in favor of moving back and saying, let's just look at smaller groups of countries and try to create smaller club-like solutions to this? What do you think?
Well, the UK used to be a member of what's called the European Union, which is a classic case of where you have a grouping of countries that had more in common than they had divided them. Now we've just left that. And we're going around the world looking for other people to do trade deals with. My only comment is that, I'm all in favor of countries working together, but I just wonder how long it would take to determine what the group was going to do, who was actually going to be in it. And by the time you'd set it up, whether or not the people who originally thought it was a good idea were still about. So I don't think there's a quick fix to the problems that we've been discussing. In some ways, it'd be far better to work on the institutions we've got, despite their imperfections. And yes, they all had imperfections. At least they were there. Obviously, as far as the European Union is concerned, Britain's not going back into it. We're not ideally placed to lecture others on solidarity just at the moment, I think.
No, I can take your point on that, and I suppose your comment about clubs and how do you put it? You're not quite sure who's going to be there. It's a reminder that if you have a club of democracies, that is per se a challenge to therefore have governments that will bring different perspectives every 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 years. As we've seen with the United States, a change in government can have a huge impact on the change of a structure of cooperation, either for the positive or for the negative. But I think you made a very clear point there, Alistair, which is invest in what we've got, try to stick for the global, even if there are limits and we're in a particularly bumpy phase right now. So I think that I can actually, one of my colleagues can call on Creon. Let me have a look here. He's not sure. If it's not, I'm going to read his question. Yeah, no, Creon, you're there. Why don't you ask your question yourself? You can introduce yourself as well. I put you just as director of our program, but obviously you've got a little bit of historical context as well.
Yes, Robin, can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks very much. Yes, indeed. I used to work in the Cabinet Office, and indeed was working in the Treasury, Lord Darling, when you were there. So this sort of takes us back a number of years. But I remember at that time that, as you say, it was absolutely crucial to get as many of the economic policies in the response aligned as we could. And indeed, in 2009, that was what was achieved. But today's crisis is very different in many ways, not least in the sense that partly because of different choices in fighting the pandemic, countries in a very different position, but also what's actually needed in terms of, say, for example, the nature of the fiscal stimulus. It's different because of the nature of the shock, but also it differs between countries. So if you're looking at the problem of international economic cooperation now, what do you think are the most important things to be coordinated? Is it in the space of fiscal policy, unwinding of monetary stimulus, structural reforms, or even on travel restrictions? And I guess the follow-up is, given what's important, what is actually politically realistic, either with the present, governments in place, or potentially after a change in administration in the US?
Well, I think the things that are most urgent is, firstly, I was talking earlier about the control of the virus. Countries were very slow to learn from each other. At the beginning of this year, what was going on, and to react accordingly. And we paid a very high price for that. Given that the virus is not gone, that it's reappearing in different parts of the world, and you had the news from Australia this morning. But I think the need to cooperate, and to not just on flagging up the spread of a virus, but also learning from each other as to how you contain it, as well as on vaccine development and so on. That's a clear example. Transport in some ways, that's really dependent on fixing the former thing. People are not going to want to return to going to airplanes unless they're reasonably confident they can do so safely, and countries don't really want to see large numbers of people coming in if they think they're going to bring the COVID virus into a particular country. But again, transport is a case in point. How can you do anything in transport if you don't cooperate with somebody else? By definition, you're flying somewhere else, or taking the train somewhere else. So I think that there's many areas. I think on the economic stimulus, what's required is probably different in most other countries. Even if you take the European Union, for example, it's in an economic unit, but of course it's not a complete economic union. What's required is different depending on which country you happen to be in, although there are clearly similarities. So I think that I wouldn't put any limit on international cooperation, but the most urgent thing I would think is needed is in relation to health. Because remember that the risk of a second wave is there. It's a very real risk. And never mind the damage to health, but the knock to confidence economies across the world would be absolutely colossal. So, there's a lot of cooperation that's needed there.
Yeah, and it's ironic, of course, you say that, Alistair, given the news out of the US yesterday about its formal move. Obviously, it does depend on Trump winning the next election, but the formal move to leave the WHO. And for those of our Chatham House members who are going to be with us this morning, we were meant to have Dr. Tedros, the Director General, on with us for a session earlier this morning, but he had to pull out to deal with a whole round of diplomatic calls earlier this morning as a result of the US announcement yesterday. So it's ironic, the one area that you have pulled out as being the most important is the one at the moment is at the very heart of that US-China standoff. And as somebody noted to me the other day, it turns out that during the Spanish flu, there was a similar US-China spat, apparently, as to where it originated, which I was not aware of, but might be worth us digging into a little bit. Look, we've only got 15 minutes left or so, and I thought what I might do is, we've done quite a bit on the international, is bring you back to the domestic, because I've got a couple of questions I'd like to pose, and do invite again others on the call if they want to be able to throw in some more questions, either on international or on the domestic. But it has been quite a turnaround domestically in terms of the profile of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, especially in this last election, where the red wall, so-called, was breached such that it enabled the Conservative Party to secure a strong majority in the House of Commons. Now, what we see from this Conservative Party, one that seems to have taken a lot of the Labour Party's clothes in terms of levelling up infrastructure, focusing on the North. How do you read this? Do you know, if you were sitting there right now, do these seem like policies that the Labour Party would have been normally taking that have been taken on board by the Conservative Party? It reminds me of Angela Merkel taking a lot of the ideas that were taken on board by Gerhard Schröder prior to her, was then able to cement the CDU into position for a very long time. What do you sense about what options are left for the Labour Party when the Conservative Party seem to have taken on this much more big government approach that you yourself said is exactly what the country needs right now? Where does that leave Labour?
Well, I don't mind people borrowing good ideas. And, you know, as this government is doing largely what we did 10 years ago, I'm hardly going to complain about it. I think if you go back to the election last December, you know, I'm afraid that, you know, Boris Johnson should be sending round a box of chocolates to Jeremy Corbyn, because, you know, frankly, that contributed to his victory more than I suspect anything that he was going to do. The second thing I'd say is that, you know, we talked about delivery on the gulf between announcement and actually seeing something on the ground. It's all very well talking about levelling up, but, you know, unless people see some evidence that something has actually happened, they might come to the conclusion that it was all words and, you know, nobody ever meant it. There's clearly a big problem in, you know, in the whole of the United Kingdom, though it manifests itself, you know, particularly in the non-metropolitan centres in England. And that is, there's a lot of towns, a lot of areas where the traditional industries, you know, heavy industries declined and disappeared in the 1980s, and nothing really was put in its place. And, you know, building roads to places is all very well. And, you know, I've said, you know, infrastructure is important, but you actually need to think about what can you put in these areas that will create jobs, that will mean that people have got money in their pockets, will go and spend them in shops and restaurants and so on. And that has eluded successive governments, frankly. And that is the urgent problem, one of the urgent problems that we need to deal with. You'll find, you know, for example, you know, if you go into areas in the northeast of England and you talk to people, I remember during the Brexit campaign, you know, nearly all that I did was actually in the north of England. You talk to people who would talk about, you know, there used to be a pit here, there used to be a sense of community. And you'd say to people, well, you know, isn't it better that your sons and daughters have got, don't have to go down the pit with all the attendant difficulties? And quite common, we say, yeah, no, but they don't live anyway. They've gone down to Manchester, or they've gone to Newcastle, or they've gone to Leeds. And they were, you know, they've got good jobs, but they're not where their parents came from. And it's that sense of people, you know, things having moved on. On top of that, the people who are there are not earning particularly great money. You know, and you know, they just feel that everything's been taken away. Now, this can't be fixed by building a road. You know, a road might help, or a railway stop might help, but it can't be fixed by that alone. And that's why the task is going to take some considerable time. Now, the problem, I'll conclude on this, that well, I mean, the many problems that Labour had in last December was it didn't have a big idea it could articulate. It had a cartload of stuff, some of which were okay, some of which wasn't. On top of which you had somebody whose poll ratings were frankly appalling. What's encouraging now is at least we've got grown-ups back in the room. You know, Keir Starmer's made a very good start. There's clearly an awful lot more that needs to be done. But, you know, frankly, the economic thinking, people will judge you on what you did in the past. But what's now needed, as I said right at the start of my contribution, is, you know, you need some vision as to what this country can be in the future. You know, economic, social, you know, and there's plenty to say about what we need to do, and, you know, talking about, you know, investment and in broadband, green, carbon reduction, and so on. There's plenty to be said, and, you know, all I would say, you know, if Boris Johnson might want to reflect on the fact that the announcement he made last week when he invoked the spirit of Roosevelt although that was the spirit may have been there, but there wasn't much else. It fell flat in its face because, frankly, it was old money and not very much of it, simply re-announcing things, and it won't make a jot of difference to any of the seats that they won last December. So, you know, I'm all for people taking good ideas. Just like, you know, if they've got a good idea, then why would we repudiate it? But what people are actually wanting from governments and from their opposition, so they've got a choice, is, well, what are you actually going to do for us that will make a difference?
Aren't people, just one more question on this, and I want to move on to another point, but aren't people asking the impossible in a way from government? Because what government can do is the road or the broadband, but what the government can't do, I don't think, unless you tell me otherwise, is make the job. So if future jobs, especially in the technology space or the service sector, in many cases, certainly in the hospitality and so on, they've just announced, as you saw, the part of the VAT reduction is going to be in the hospitality, restaurants, accommodation, etc. side. These generally are not the highest paid jobs. They're not the ones, as you said, that created that sense of community. Is it not the case that whether you're Labour or Conservative, it is not in government's capacity to create the jobs of the future? You're going to have to go further back down into education, some aspects of infrastructure, and then just hope that you can cultivate a creative enough population for investment and for them themselves to create their own jobs, or for others to come in and invest and bring their investment into the country. Isn't it that although we talk about this era being the era of big government, there's not a lot government can do about making jobs? They can do everything else, but not the jobs bit.
Well, let me give you an example. And I know that there are cities I'm going to refer to, but you know, there's a particular reason for it. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, if you look at some of Britain's big cities, I'll give you two examples. One's Glasgow, one's Manchester, which, you know, the heavy industries, cotton, all the rest of it, they'd moved on. And yet both those cities today, and absent the virus, but both these cities today, by and large, have done extremely well because they reinvented themselves. What's common to both of them is they've both got world-class universities in them. There's good quality public services. You know, the hospitality industry that you refer to grew off the back of that, and it employs an awful lot of people in this country, which ought to worry all of us just at the moment. And of course, when you've got things like the health service, which spawns research and so on. When you get that agglomeration, you attract more people into it. What we have not yet managed, I suppose Greater Manchester is a case in point where you see that in Manchester, but look at some of the peripheral towns with it that has not spread out. It's that sort of thing. You can point Newcastle, exactly the same thing happened, except, not very far from Newcastle, you've clearly got a lot of things to do. So no, governments can't just say, right, here's a factory, here's everything you need, here's the restaurants, we've done it all. But what you can do is just think about what makes for a successful growth area. Now if we didn't have this conversation 50 years ago, you'd have been talking about what are we going to do about Britain's rundown cities. Now a lot of them we've actually we've moved on. Although, let me say it before somebody else does, within some of these cities, and London is no exception, you may have got some of the most prosperous areas in the land, but you've also got some of the poorest.
So, I think a key element for me in your answer just there, Alistair, and it was really good that you gave examples, specific cities, what's happened, how it changed. Your point about universities, having this sort of creative flow of ideas for businesses, being able to take innovation, move it out into the community, and for it not to leave, but for those jobs potentially to stay in the area, incredibly important. And I think your point, though, about the greater areas often being the sources of problem, these smaller towns and so on around the agglomerations, is also very well taken. One other point I can't resist bringing to you, and if anyone has any last questions, we're getting down to the last couple here, so we can finish on time. You did mention here about the kind of devolution of power. Scotland. It does strike me that the COVID-19 crisis, just looking at this from sitting in London, which is not a very good place to assess this from, you're a much better place than I am, but it does strike me that we've really seen the voice of the devolved regions, but in particular Scotland, Northern Ireland, Welsh as well, and the Welsh Assembly have acquired a much stronger voice, but almost a separate voice and a more separate sense of identity as a result of this COVID-19 crisis. If we were to look ahead 5 or 10 years' time, Do you think you're going to be back on the stumping ground trying to fight better together again a second time? What's your take?
Well, look, health is devolved, and rightly so. It always has been distinct. If we just stand back from this, just a point to bear in mind. Unfortunately, the mortality rate in Scotland was as high as it was in England, particularly in care homes. And the reason for that is that both countries, in fact, all over the UK, we started the lockdown rather more slowly than we should have done, right at the start. What is undoubtedly the case is the communication of the policy in Scotland has been more articulate than it has been in England. Broadly speaking, the policies implemented here are much the same as they are. Frankly, as someone who's sitting in Edinburgh, it is baffling if you watch the evening news as to when everything's coming into force, because you're hearing dates here, there, and everywhere. And trying to remember what's happened and what's happened, not happened is difficult. I think it's probably fair to say that Scotland is taking a more cautious approach, which is fine, because I think that's where people are generally. The actual substance of the policies has not been that different. You then go on to a broader point. We'll have to see whether or not there's another referendum. Up until recently, it's fairly clear that actually opinion hadn't changed that much. It's changed slightly in the last couple of weeks or so. I just wonder whether or not people in Scotland, having had a referendum 6 years ago, having had this virus, are now ready for possibly yet another upheaval. But we shall just have to see what transpires.
This has been one of the big worries, to the extent to which the mood might have changed. Exactly, sorry, I don't know if it was a question or not, but I will throw it in quickly as a follow-up. Scotland now has a clear suppress and eliminate strategy. The UK doesn't. It looks more like contain. These will have very different health and economic outcomes. Which do you think is right? Suppress and eliminate, or contain?
Well, it would be very good to eliminate. Whether or not you can do that, I don't know. Rather than the Scotland-England divide, I think would be far better, both in Scotland and in England, and Wales and Northern Ireland for that matter, to get to the point that I alluded to earlier, where there will be, an upsurge of this virus from time to time. There has been in southwest Scotland over the last few days, where if you can isolate it, contain it, then you've got a better chance of eliminating it. I think a blanket regime for all of England, all of Scotland, that is very, very damaging. Not just in economic terms, but also in human terms. And I should make this point that made earlier. People say, well, lots of things are going to change. The one thing is not going to change is that people's desire for human contact, and you can see that now. North and south of the border, people are becoming very impatient. They won't be able to see each other, and the best way of doing that is to make sure that we can isolate any future outbreaks right down, if possible, to the street where they're occurring, never mind the town. And that's a better approach than, I think, looking at a countrywide solution.
Well, as you said, you might be able to suppress and eliminate in Scotland, but if it's not suppressed and eliminated in the rest of the United Kingdom, that may be a moot achievement. Last question, just a typical sort of big one. If you had your one worry, the thing you're sitting there in the Chancellor's office today, I know you're very happy not to be, I'm sure, but if you were and you were looking ahead 1 year ahead from now, what's the thing that worries you the most, and what do you feel most optimistic about? Your one big worry, maybe you're the thing you're most optimistic about, and the thing you're most worried about 1 year from now.
My big worry would be a recurrence of the virus or something similar, because it would be both on morale and the economy and health. It would be very bad. On the optimistic side, the world generally, and us in particular, have got through crises in the past. We will do. I'm confident of that. The only question is how long and at what price. It's trying to eliminate that that price, or you get that price down as low as you possibly can. That's the thing that the government needs to concentrate on. And I see cutting VAT on a limited basis as a good idea after all.
Glad, exactly. There was one specific step taken there, which hopefully will make a bit of a difference. So you're probably looking at all sorts of household appliances they were hoping to be able to buy at a cheaper price. And this is more about getting people out than maybe leaving them at home some more to those points. Alistair Darling, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us today and range from domestic, really in detail, to some of these big international questions. I think you really nailed it on some of your comments about, you were very clear, this is not a time to create smaller groupings of countries. This is a time to really try to hold on to the global responses. And that in itself is one side of the debate, is what I'd say. So it was very helpful that you were very clear about that, and you made your comments as well about the chances for the UK. Just on your first point, I do want to let our guests here today know that we've got some more interesting events coming up this week. Tomorrow evening at 6 p.m, I'll be chairing Bob Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, who is very much the architect of the Trump administration's much more zero-sum, should we say, approach to trade policy. But having heard a number of the Trump administration talk both privately and publicly about what they're doing here, they have a plan. People may agree with it or disagree with it, but they have a plan, and we'll be able to discuss that with Bob Lighthizer tomorrow. And then to wind up the week at 3 p.m. on Friday, we'll have a much bigger question about the future of global leadership with Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, chair of the Elders Group, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former President of Liberia, a former, highly recognized and awarded leader, both of them. So I think it should be a very interesting conversation with both of them at 3 p.m. on Friday. All sorts of other meetings taking place as well. My colleagues have helpfully sent a note in the chat line for those of you able to see it. So you can click on the link. It's also on our website. But once again, Alistair, thank you very much. I don't know if we can unmute one or two people to say a big thank you or applaud you in distance. Unfortunately, most people are outside that capacity, but we really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for your thoughts. Thank you for being one of our presidents of Chatham House. Great to have had you and your thoughts on our centenary week. Keep well.
Thank you very much.
All the best, Alistair. Bye-bye.